Wyoming Territory, May of 1879. The wind smelled like rain and distant smoke when Declan Sutton spotted the overturned wagon just off the rutted trail near the edge of his grazing land. The horses were gone. One wheel was sheared clean off. A trunk had spilled open, its contents scattered in the dirt, a child's knitted sock, a broken china doll, the pages of a Bible fluttering. And then, from the tall grass beside the wreck, a woman stood. She was slim, her hair wind-tangled, her dress torn at the hem. Her face was streaked with dust, but her eyes were sharp and alert. Her arms wrapped protectively around a small girl who clung to her skirts. Declan reined in his horse, boots hitting the ground with a thud. The girl, no more than 4 years old, hid behind the woman's legs, peeking out with wide green eyes. "Are you hurt?" Declan asked, his voice rough from disuse. He had not spoken to anyone in weeks. The woman blinked at him like she was trying to decide if he was real. "No, we're not hurt," she said, her voice hoarse. "But we've been here since yesterday." The wheel snapped and the team bolted. She glanced around as if afraid something might come back. "We could not pull the wagon up ourselves." Declan's eyes moved back to the girl. She was thin, her cheeks pale. "You have food?" "Some," the woman said. "Not much." She straightened, shielding the girl with her body. "My name's Florence Adler. This is my daughter, Kailey." He nodded once. "Declan Sutton. My homestead's half a mile up. You can come with me." Florence hesitated just a moment, then looked down at Kailey. The girl gave a silent nod, and Florence exhaled in relief. "Thank you," she said quietly. They rode double on Declan's horse. Kailey nestled safely between them. The silence was filled with the creak of leather and the steady beat of hooves. Florence held tight, her hands firm at his waist, and Declan felt the warmth of her against his back, felt something stir where he had long been cold. His homestead came into view as the first drops of rain began to fall, a small log house, a fenced corral, a barn in need of mending. The chimney puffed smoke. The place looked empty, but lived in. Declan helped Florence down, then lifted Kailey gently from the saddle. Her arms wrapped around his neck without a word, and something inside him cracked just a little. Inside, the house was plain: one room, a table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove. A quilt lay folded on the narrow bed. Declan motioned to it. "You can rest here. I'll fix something warm." Florence eased down onto the edge of the bed, pulling Kailey into her lap. Her gaze swept the room, landing on a tin-framed photograph on the mantel. "You live alone?" "I do now," Declan said. He did not explain. He stirred beans and bacon into a pot, added water and salt. While it cooked, he fetched a dry blanket from the trunk and draped it over Kailey's shoulders. She looked up at him, then leaned into his side. He stayed still, letting her. Florence watched him with quiet eyes. "You do not talk much," she said. "Not much to say," he replied. But the way her smile lifted, soft and tired and grateful, it filled the quiet space between them with something that felt like breath returning to lungs after a long time without air. They ate in silence. Kailey curled up on the bed and was asleep before the bowl left her hands. Declan stoked the fire, then sat across from Florence as the wind picked up outside. "Where were you headed?" he asked. "North," she said. "My husband died last winter. We were going to try Idaho. We had cousins near Boise, but the trail was harder than I expected." Declan studied her. "You came alone?" "I had no choice." Her voice held no drama, no self-pity. Just fact. Declan respected that. Florence looked down at her hands. "We'll leave in the morning, if you can help us get the wagon righted." "You will not," Declan said plainly. "That wagon is no good. Storm's coming. You stay here until it passes." Florence opened her mouth, then closed it again, eyes flicking toward Kailey. "All right." Late that night, Declan lay awake on a pallet beside the fire. Florence slept on the bed, Kailey tucked beside her. Rain beat against the roof in steady rhythm, and now and then, Florence would shift, her hand moving to check Kailey's breathing, her body curling protectively. She was strong, not loud about it, not proud, but strong. Declan turned toward the fire, listening to the sound of rain and the quiet breathing of a woman and child who had stumbled into his life like a wind through a locked door. By morning, the storm had passed. The world outside was green and washed clean, and the sky stretched wide and blue. Declan stepped outside to chop wood, and when he returned, he found Florence at the stove, sleeves rolled up, stirring something in a pan. The smell of eggs and flour filled the room. "You did not have to," he said. "I wanted to," she said, not looking up. Kailey sat at the table, humming softly to herself, her small feet swinging. Declan sat across from her. "You feeling better this morning?" She nodded, a biscuit clutched in one hand. Florence turned and set a plate in front of him. "Thought I should earn our place a little." "You do not owe me anything," Declan said. "I know," she said softly, "but I want to." Later, they walked back to the wagon. It was as ruined as Declan expected. He helped Florence gather what was not broken clothes, a few books, a locket from the ground. She clutched it tightly, then tucked it into her bodice. When they reached the homestead again, Florence looked at the house, then at him. "If it is not too much trouble, maybe we could stay a few more days, just until I can figure out what next." Declan met her eyes. "You can stay as long as you need." Florence smiled. This time it was not tired or weary. It was warm, open, like a candle lit in a dark room. And just like that, something shifted. Not spoken, not named, but real. Hope. The next morning, the sun came up behind the hills, pale gold and slow, and Declan was already outside, mending a rail on the corral fence with a steady rhythm. The air smelled of new grass and damp earth. A pair of magpies darted between the cottonwoods near the creek, their wings catching the light. Inside the cabin, Florence stood at the wash basin, brushing Kailey's hair with careful strokes. The girl sat on a stool, her feet tucked up beneath her, humming to herself. "I'll help him today," Florence said quietly. Kailey looked up. "With the fence. With whatever he needs." She tied the ribbon at the end of the braid, then kissed the top of her daughter's head. "You'll stay where I can see you, all right?" Kailey nodded and slid from the stool, reaching for her rag doll. Florence stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. Declan didn't look up, just kept hammering the rail into place, the muscles in his forearm shifting under his rolled sleeve. "Morning," she said. He gave her a glance, then passed her a length of wire. "Hold that end steady." She took it without hesitation. Her boots sank slightly into the damp soil, and the wind caught the edge of her skirt. They worked in silence for a time, their movements in rhythm without needing words. "Where'd you learn fence work?" he asked eventually. "My father ran cattle in Missouri when I was young. Before the war." She twisted the wire taut. "He said a girl ought to know how to keep her stock in and her neighbors out." Declan gave a rare huff of approval. "Smart man." He didn't smile much either, she added, eyeing him sidelong. He didn't answer, but there was a twitch at the corner of his mouth. They finished the rail and moved on to the next. The sun had climbed high enough to warm their backs, and Kailey was near the porch, lining up small stones in a row and murmuring to herself. Florence wiped her brow. "You always work alone?" "Mostly. No hired hands. No need. I keep the herd small." She looked out toward the grazing land, the slope of it gentle, dotted with cattle. "It's a good spread. You built all this yourself." "Over time." She didn't press. He handed her a pair of pliers and she took them, their fingers brushing. At midday, she spread a cloth on a stump and laid out bread and cold beans. Declan sat beside her, resting his elbows on his knees. Kailey crawled into her mother's lap, her hands sticky with juice from a wild plum. Declan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden horse, roughly carved, edges smoothed from years of handling. He offered it to Kailey without a word. She stared at it, then took it gently, cradling it in her palm. "Did you make it?" He nodded. Can I keep it? He nodded again. Florence watched him, something unreadable flickering in her gaze. You were a father once. Declan didn't answer right away. I was. She didn't ask more. Instead, she reached out and touched his hand just once before turning her attention back to her daughter. That evening, Kailey fell asleep near the hearth, the wooden horse clutched to her chest. Florence stood at the window, arms folded, watching the last light fade behind the hills. Declan poured water into the basin and handed her a cloth. She took it without question, dipping it and wringing it out. I can cook better than what I made yesterday, she said softly. Give me a few days, I'll prove it. I don't need proving. She looked at him, her eyes steady. Maybe I need it. He didn't try to argue. Outside, an owl called from the tree-line. The fire crackled behind them, and the air in the room shifted, close and quiet. Florence laid the cloth aside. When the wagon overturned, I thought we might die out there, she said. And I kept thinking if we did, no one would ever know who we were. Not really. Not what mattered. Declan's voice was low. You're not lost anymore. She stepped closer. Neither are you. They stood like that, neither moving, until Kailey stirred in her sleep and murmured something unintelligible. Florence knelt to tuck the quilt tighter around her. Declan watched her, his hands curling into fists at his sides, not from tension, but from the weight of something unnamed that had begun to unravel in him. Later, when the cabin had gone quiet and the moon cast long shadows across the floor, he lay awake again, listening to the steady sound of her breath, the faint rustle of the covers each time she shifted in sleep. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long while he had no urge to push it away. The hens were restless that morning, clucking low and pacing their pen as Florence scattered grain into the dirt. The feed sack was light in her arms, the bottom near empty, and she made note of it silently. Declan hadn't said how often he got into town, but she hadn't seen any signs of travel in days. Kailey sat on the porch step with a length of twine and a stick, trying to mimic a snare she'd seen Declan set near the creek. Her tongue pressed between her teeth in concentration. Florence watched her for a moment, then turned toward the barn. Declan was inside, oiling the yoke straps. His hat hung on a nail, and the morning light through the slats striped the floor in gold and shadow. She stepped in without calling out. You planning on heading into town soon? She asked, folding her arms loosely. Tomorrow, if the weather holds. He didn't look up from his work. Need salt and lamp oil. Could you use company? His hands paused over the leather. It's a half-day's ride. I've ridden longer. She leaned against the post. I've got coin left, and I'd like to choose what we need. He straightened then, setting the strap aside. It's a long ride for a child. She can stay here. If you trust me, I trust you. He studied her face. You sure? She nodded once. There's a kindness in this place. I want her to feel safe in it. Declan's gaze drifted past her toward the porch where Kailey now held the stick up like a rifle, aiming at an invisible deer. She'll be safe, he said. I'll let Mrs. Rusk know we'll pass through. Florence tilted her head. Neighbor? Widow. Keeps hens and a milk cow. Lives a mile east. Florence smiled faintly. I'll make bread to bring her. Declan's brow lifted, but he said nothing more. The next morning, just after sunrise, they saddled the mare and packed a small sack of goods. Kailey stood barefoot on the porch, arms folded across her chest, watching them like she was trying not to cry. Florence knelt in front of her. You'll help Mrs. Rusk gather eggs, won't you? Kailey gave a jerky nod. You'll come back by supper? Before then, if the mare keeps pace. She brushed Kailey's hair back. You be good. Declan waited until the girl had gone inside, then handed Florence the reins. They rode out in silence, hooves striking soft against the damp trail. The land stretched wide and golden, the trees just beginning to bud with summer's promise. Birds flitted from branch to branch overhead. Declan watched the trail ahead, his shoulders relaxed, his rifle tied behind the saddle. Florence shifted her weight slightly. You don't talk much when you ride either. Don't see the need. She gave a soft sound, not quite laughter. My husband used to talk the whole way into town. Said if he didn't, the silence would fill up with worries. Declan gave a slow nod, still watching the horizon. Silence doesn't bother me. Used to bother me, she said. Not anymore. They passed a line of cottonwoods where the creek curved close to the trail. Florence looked down at the water, its surface smooth and dark. You fish? Not often. He glanced toward the far bank. Too many traps to check, too many fences to walk. You always that practical? Not always. She looked at him sideways. No? Used to draw maps when I was a boy. Rivers, hills, places I'd never seen. What changed? War came. I stopped drawing. Florence's voice was quiet. You could start again, if you wanted. He didn't answer. The wind moved through the grass like breath. Town was small, 3 dusty streets and a few weathered buildings. They tied the mare outside the mercantile and stepped inside, the bell above the door clinking softly. The air smelled of burlap and dried apples. Florence moved through the shelves with a practiced eye, selecting flour, matches, a length of calico for Kailey, and a jar of preserves. Declan added coffee and a new blade for his whittling knife. At the counter, the shopkeeper gave a look between them that lingered too long. Florence met it without blinking. We'll take it all, she said, pulling her coin purse from her sleeve. Declan set a hand lightly on hers. I can cover it. I know, she said gently, but I want to. They left the shop with their parcels wrapped in brown paper and twine. As they crossed the street, Florence nodded toward the livery. Wouldn't take much to repair the old wagon frame. I saw a man in there working on worse. You looking to leave already? Declan asked, his tone unreadable. No, she said. Not yet. But it's good to have choices. He glanced at her. You thinking of Idaho again? I don't know. She held the packages tighter. I just want a life that doesn't feel borrowed. Neither spoke the rest of the way home, but the silence wasn't heavy. It felt like something settling into place. Kailey came running down the hill when she saw them, her arms full of dandelions. I helped measure flour, she shouted. And she let me churn butter. Florence lifted her down from the mare. Did you remember your manners? Kailey nodded solemnly, then handed Declan the flowers. For the table. He took them without a word and went to fetch a jar. That evening, they ate stew and fresh bread, the dandelions in the center of the table, their yellow faces bright against the wood. After the meal, Florence stepped outside to wash the basin. The air was warm, the sky streaked with lavender and rose. Declan stood beside her, rinsing the ladle. You ever think about staying? She asked. I do. She turned toward him. And I'm waiting to see what you'll decide. Florence dried her hands on her apron. Then I suppose we'll both wait. Just a little longer. He nodded once. No hurry, no pressure. Just the quiet understanding that something had begun, and neither was ready to let it go. Florence stood ankle-deep in the creek, skirts hitched high and pinned, her bare feet pressing into the smooth stones beneath the current. A tin pail floated beside her, tethered by a length of twine looped through its handle. She bent now and then to scoop water, face shaded by the brim of the straw hat Mrs. Rusk had loaned her. Declan watched from the bank, one hand resting on the worn handle of his axe. He'd come down to fell a sapling for fence posts, but hadn't raised the blade yet. Creek's colder than I thought, Florence said, glancing up. Snowmelt from the wind rivers, he replied. Doesn't warm much even in July. She pushed a wet strand of hair from her cheek. Kailey's been asking if she can wade. I told her no until I checked for myself. Declan crouched, tipping a pebble loose with his thumb. Deeper toward the bend. Current picks up there. Florence straightened, rubbing her arms briskly. Then I'll keep her near the shallows. He stood. You thinking of teaching her to swim? If I can remember how, she said, stepping out of the stream and into the patchy sunlight. It's been a long time since I had cause. They walked back toward the house together, her pail swinging loosely now. The tall grass brushed against her legs and the late morning hum of insects filled the air. Near the porch, Kailey sat cross-legged with a strip of muslin in her lap and a needle clutched in her fingers. "I'm making a pillow for my horse," she called without looking up. Florence crouched beside her. "You remember what I told you about the running stitch?" "I do," Kailey said. "But it keeps turning crooked." Florence examined the cloth. "That's all right? Horses aren't fussy." Declan leaned on the porch rail, watching them. "I've got a spare scrap of wool in the saddle shed. Might be softer for stuffing." Kailey's needle paused midair. "Can I use it?" He nodded. "I'll bring it in." Florence stood, brushing her hands on her skirt. "She's never had much time to be a child. I forget what that looks like sometimes." Declan opened the door. "She's not forgetting." Later that afternoon, the wind shifted. Florence was kneading dough when the first tendrils of smoke reached the homestead, not thick enough to alarm, but sharp enough to draw notice. She stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron, and turned toward the west. The sun caught a faint smear of gray in the far distance, low and slow-moving. Declan was already at the corral, tightening the girth on his bay gelding. Florence crossed to him, her brows drawn. "Lightning strike." "No storm today," he said. "Could be someone clearing brush." She squinted toward the hills. "It's too dry." He tied off the cinch. "I'll ride out. See how far it's spread." Florence looked toward the cabin, then back to him. "If you think it's close, I'll come back if it is." Kailey appeared in the doorway, holding the stuffed pillow to her chest. "Stay near the house," Declan said, swinging into the saddle. "Keep a bucket at the well." Florence nodded, her jaw tight. "Be careful." He touched the brim of his hat and rode out, the horse's hooves muffled in the tall grass. The sun passed low as Florence waited. She kept Kailey near, and the girl helped fetch water without complaint, understanding without needing explanation. The breeze carried no more smoke, but Florence scanned the hills until her eyes burned. When Declan returned, his shirt was dark with sweat and his face streaked with soot. Florence met him halfway to the barn. "Westridge," he said. "Caught in some deadfall." 2 other riders were already there. "We cut a line and soaked what we could. Will it hold? For now." She reached for his sleeve without thinking and found her fingers brushing ash. "You should wash. I'll heat water." He didn't move. "I saw a cabin west of the ridge. Burned sometime before. Not from this fire." He looked at her. "Horse bones nearby. Wagon axle too." Florence's breath caught. "How long ago?" "Hard to say. Snows cleared the worst of it." She swallowed. "It could have been us." "It wasn't." She looked up at him, his face lined with smoke and fatigue, and something in her chest loosened. Inside, Kailey set the pillow carefully on the bed. "He smells like chimney," she said, wrinkling her nose. Florence smiled faintly. "That's what happens when you go chasing fires." Declan poured water into the basin, steam curling from the surface. Florence dipped a cloth and pressed it to his temple, wiping away soot. He held still beneath her touch, eyes closed. "You could have let it burn," she said. "Could have," he murmured. "But you didn't." He opened his eyes. "Not everything's worth saving. But some things are." She didn't look away. "You think you've got room for more?" "I'm making room." She set the cloth aside, her hand lingering on his jaw. "Good," she said, "because I think we'll need it." Outside, the sky turned the color of ripe peaches. The last of the smoke thinned into nothing, and Kailey climbed onto the porch rail, the wooden horse in her hand, humming a tune she made up as she went. By mid-July, the heat settled into the valley like breath held too long. The wind carried dust instead of rain, and the grass along the ridge dulled to a dry yellow. Florence hung strips of muslin soaked in vinegar over the windows to keep the cabin cool for Kailey, and Declan spent most afternoons out past the southern fence line, checking for breaks where deer had passed through. One afternoon, Florence stood on the porch, a sprig of mint tucked behind her ear, watching Kailey and Mrs. Rusk shell peas beneath the cottonwood. The older woman had brought over a crock of buttermilk and a hand-sewn doll she said had belonged to her niece. Kailey hadn't let it out of her sight since. Florence turned when the screen door creaked. Declan stepped out, a ledger tucked under his arm. His shirt clung to his back from the heat, and there was a stain of pitch across his right elbow. "I was thinking," he said, nodding toward the field, "it's near time to cut a few rows of hay." If the weather holds, I could use another set of hands. Florence wiped her palms on her skirt. I can pitch as well as tether. I wasn't asking you, he said, then gave her a sidelong glance. I was asking if you'd help me hire someone. She tilted her head. You mean to take on a hand? Just through the harvest, he said. After that, we'll see. She studied him. That's the first time you've said we. He didn't look away. I meant it. She stepped down from the porch, the grass crackling underfoot. There's a boy in town, works odd jobs at the livery. Quiet but steady. Name's Elias. He helped mend the wagon bed last month. Bring him out then, Declan said. If he's good with his hands. Florence brushed a bit of straw from his shoulder. And if he's not, we'll keep looking. Together. The next morning, Florence rode into town with Kailey and returned with Elias by noon. The boy looked no older than 16, lanky and sunburned, with hands too big for his frame. He tipped his hat to Declan and got to work without a word, moving like he'd grown up around tools. That night, Florence braided Kailey's damp hair while Declan carved in the corner, the shavings curling at his feet. She's been sleeping sounder, he said, not looking up. No more waking in the middle of the night? Florence tied off the braid. Not since she found that mint patch behind the henhouse. She says it keeps bad dreams out. He set aside the carving, another small horse, and crossed the room. I've been thinking about the land north of the creek. It's shaded, has good soil. If you wanted a garden. Or something more. Florence looked up. What do you mean? I mean if you wanted to stay, he said. Not for the season. Not until you find your footing. I mean stay. She stood slowly, Kailey already dozing beside the hearth. What would that look like? We'd build on, he said. A second room, maybe two. A root cellar. I've got boards saved for it. Florence stepped close, her voice low. And what would I be to you? Declan's eyes didn't waver. My wife. If you'd have me. Her hand rose to touch his chest, just above his heart. You'd take me with the storms I carry? I already have. She leaned in, her mouth brushing his. The kiss was quiet, full of understanding rather than urgency. When she pulled back, her breath caught in her throat. You sure about this? I've never been more. They married under the cottonwood where Kailey and Mrs. Rusk had shelled peas. The widow lent her Sunday dress, and Declan wore his best shirt, sleeves pressed and collar stiff. Elias stood as witness, and Kailey scattered wildflowers across the grass with careful steps. Afterward, they shared bread and honey and passed a tin cup of cider between them. The sun dipped low behind the hills, and Florence stood with her hand tucked into Declan's, her eyes on the place where the sky turned lavender. That night, Kailey slept in the small bed tucked into the corner, her doll beside her. Declan and Florence lay beneath the quilt she'd stitched from leftover muslin and calico, their hands intertwined between them. I used to wonder if I'd ever feel safe again, she whispered. He kissed the inside of her wrist. You are. She turned into him, breath warm against his throat. You are too. The weeks that followed passed in steady rhythm. The hay came in, the calf born late that August survived the first hard rain, and Kailey started writing her own name in the dust on the porch rail. Mrs. Rusk came by with sewing patterns, and Elias moved into the bunkhouse Declan built with Florence's help. They put in a garden north of the creek, just like she'd wanted, beans, carrots, and a row of sunflowers that leaned toward the house come morning. On their first winter night, snow soft on the roof and a stew warming by the fire, Florence knelt beside Kailey's bed and tucked the quilt under her chin. She kissed her daughter's brow, rose without a word, and stepped into the arms of the man who had waited when she hadn't known how to ask. Declan held her, one hand at the small of her back, the other cupping her jaw, and kissed her like it was the first time. Outside, the wind shaped drifts against the door. Inside, the fire burned low and steady, and the house held the hush of something hard-earned and lasting. They never left the valley. The cabin grew room by room, and so did their family. The garden flourished, and Kailey ran wild through the tall grass, her laughter echoing off the hills. She called Declan Pa by her own choosing, and he taught her how to track deer and plant potatoes deep enough the frost wouldn't touch them. Florence taught her to sew and to speak her mind with grace. There were dry years and wet ones, early frosts and late calves. But the house never lost its warmth. The love that built it only deepened. And each night, when the fire burned low and the door was bolted against the dark, Declan and Florence lay side by side, no longer waiting for the next change, but living it together, hand in hand.